We're going to start our class, and I also wanted to point out that we have Kathy O'Neill, our superstar math and data scientist. It was it on TED Radio Hour? She used this term math-splaining, which I thought was really great. But she's the author of Weapons of Math Destruction. So I've given her permission to interrupt and heckle and augment our initial presentation to briefly cover some of the stuff in your readings around algorithmic bias, and then we'll have her jump in and help us with a way to frame ethics. Is that right? And the philosophers are welcome to chime in there, and then we'll open it up to a conversation. So today is on algorithmic bias. It's a very simple sounding thing, but as you probably have noticed as you read and dig into it, it becomes very, very elusive in both what it means and what we need to do about it. And so hopefully we'll get to some of the really interesting questions today. These are some quotes. Pedro Dominguez, this master algorithm for anybody who wants a fairly nice overview of sort of the various ways to think about and understand machine learning. It's a good book. Some of the parts are a little bit dense, but I would recommend it. But anyway, he says people who worry that computers will get too smart and take over the world, well, the real problem is they're too stupid and they've already taken over the world. And I think that's Kate Crawford also quoted this in one of her well-known papers as well. But I think this is, to me, one of the key things about this class, which is we're sort of worried about AI. And we'll talk about algorithms, but there are very simple algorithms that are already sort of taking over society in a somewhat semi-autonomous way and are causing all kinds of problems. And I think that, as we talked about during the weekend kicking off, I think that, we can speculate about the long-term problems of superintelligence, but I think dealing with the immediate issues of stupid algorithms is really what we want to focus on. And then this is something that Karthik has been working a lot on, which is trying to distinguish between correlation and causal meaning. And again, especially when you look at things like the justice system, there's a whole fairness point, which is just looking at highly predictive correlations isn't really fair, because it means that if you are born in a certain zip code, is it fair that you should have longer sentences? Is it fair that you should be over-policed? And this whole notion of societal fairness comes up, and the focus of a lot of machine learning today is really on statistical prediction, and especially if we're trying to address the underlying causes and make society better, rather than just more efficiently executing society, I think it's really important to think about the causal meaning. Bias has so many meanings, so we'll start by making a few definitions. So the legal meaning, a personal and often unreasonable judgment for or against one side in a dispute. So this is, this is biasing in favor of somebody when you're making a judgment. And then the statistical discussion about bias is very different, which is sort of that because of the data or the algorithm, you somehow are lopsided and inaccurate is another way of thinking about it. And obviously, as we start to look at some of the problems, is that often there are trade-offs. When you try to eliminate one category of bias, you create another. This is machine learning, so if you have read some of the readings on machine learning, what you're trying to do is to try to find a line that classifies, let's say, two different sets accurately. Underfitting is when you have low accuracy, but a bias. And this is sort of the bias in the sense of the machine learning sense. If you have overfitting is when you are trained the data set so much that you have very high accuracy, but on a completely new data set, it will be completely wrong. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to get these algorithms that are appropriately fitted. And again, this is a different meaning, different definition of bias. And so I think when we have to be careful as we talk today and we discuss, use the term bias, we should be a little bit specific about what we mean when we say bias. There's latent bias, which is, and this is an example of, if you look at translation systems that just take a very accurate corpus of, let's say with Google Translate, which is taking real live translations of conversations and texts that we have, and then you ask the question, man is to computer programmer as women is to, and then it will give you the answer, homemaker. And obviously, that's something that when you read, you say, oh, that's an unfair bias. The computer got it all wrong. But the computer actually, probably, the algorithm is probably quite good, and what got it all wrong is society got it all wrong. So what you're doing here is that you have to realize that there is bias in society, and the data, even if it's accurate, reflects the biases in society, and accurate algorithm will just expose those biases. And so as we think about society, and this may not necessarily be true, but if we hope that society is evolving towards good, if you are taking historical data and you're just reinforcing it, and let's say that you start having computers that now start writing texts and then other computers parsing the text, you could imagine that you're just starting to reinforce these biases that are already in society. So I think one of the problems is we all know that society is biased, so why would it be true that the data isn't biased? In fact, I think Karthik would argue that there is no such thing as no bias. And so I think this is another interesting thing, is there's this sort of ideal that we're trying to make the world fair and unbiased, but in fact, there is no such thing as bias in the sense that almost looking at anything from any particular perspective is a form of bias.
Can I
yeah, jump in.
So my impulse is always to sort of try to bring it to something that matters a lot to humans. And I think like this is actually already just sort of an academically interesting thing, but it's not, we haven't played it out in the world, right? So it could just be an academically interesting thing and end there, but like, it actually probably isn't, right? Probably ads on Google, for example, are tailored to people based on what the words are in the ads. And jobs, advertisements for jobs, if they're using something along these lines, which we should assume they are, would send women certain ads and men other ads. So and I'm not saying that's actually happening, that specific thing, but I'm just making the point that I don't want us to stop here and say, oh, algorithms pick up bias of the world around us. Like, that's true, but it's not, we haven't gone far enough. Like, the problem with that is when we pretend that that's not happening and we apply it in a specific situation. Actually, Google at some point announced last year that they were going to start matchmaking between Google users and jobs. And that really alarmed me for basically this reason, because they would be using historical information about what kinds of jobs people like you got. And as soon as you do that, you think, oh shit, like you're going to pick up all the historical bias around jobs and stuff. And I'm not saying that bias doesn't already exist, but I do think it's a step further away from us improving as a society in a long-term way when Google says we're going to codify this in a code and not talk about the nuance of what that actually will look like. So I actually talked to the guy who was running Google Ireland, and I was like, don't let this happen. And so far, I haven't heard it happen. I think they stepped away from that. And I think they stepped away from it because of this kind of academic study. So it's very important stuff, but I think we just take one more step to say, when is this actually bad? Because actually it could be used for good too. Like, it's been used for good by educating us. But just as often it's being used, this kind of bias is like thoughtlessly being applied in real world situations that matter.
And I think I'd add two little things to that. I think Jonathan Zittrain talked a little bit about the Facebook ads stuff that Julia Angwin pointed out. And by the way, she's coming and we'll be giving a talk on Thursday, I think, right? Friday. So definitely.
She's the best.
She's great. But one of the things that's interesting about ads is ads are all actually opportunities, right? So actually, I heard you guys are in Harvard Law School, so you love this. That I think First Republic Bank, which is a sort of high-end bank, apparently sent messages to all Harvard Law School graduates, at least that this guy knew, and offered to refinance their student loans to the lowest possible rate, and if they open an account with them. I mean, so it's an economically rational thing to try to make your customers the wealthiest people in society. And so the economically rational thing is statistically to go after customers who have money and exploit things that are vulnerable. And I think that even if it's accurate, it's still unfair if you think about the fact that you're using science and technology to really reinforce these biases. And we talk about income disparity, well, that's even if it's working perfectly, it works that way. And then the other problem is, again, this point about correlation. So what if you happen to be the two people in this category who should have that offer, who should have that job, you're being discriminated against? And so I guess the meta point here is, even if it is accurate, there are fundamental problems with it. And to Kathy's point, when you actually think about how people are going to use this for credit or for jobs, it becomes a real thing. This is another example of an AI beauty contest. What could go wrong? and this is about training sets. So if you're training the data set on a beauty contest with white faces, white people, you're going to end up with a whole bunch of winners that are white people. And again, this is just sort of even if the algorithm is well designed, obviously if you don't design the data. And the problem is the algorithm can also be poorly designed, which confounds it even more. This is, and the next section is, this is Google, right? This is, if you search for hands, you end up with a whole bunch of white hands because it's trained on white people. This was in the news, which was that it was classifying people with dark faces as gorillas. And so there was a public outcry against it. And so what did Google do? They made it so that if you now search for gorilla, nothing shows up. So they weren't actually able to easily fix the algorithm, which is also an interesting thing. And I think we have a team in the assembly working on adversarial systems. But it's not simple to just correct these problems, because if it's built into the underlying data and the engineers who have trained the data don't actually know, like it's not like you have a little bit of code that you can analyze and then fix. You actually have to rethink how you train the whole system. And so you can't just fix the biases that you find. And again, Julia Anglin's great because she keeps finding weird things in Facebook that are completely unfair, and then she talks about it and they put a little patch, and then she finds another one. And so I think one of the really interesting things is on the edges you will continue to find these things, and I don't think that it's simple to just identify how to eliminate them.
I'll jump in, if you don't mind, in that previous slide. So the first thing, the way I interpret this is, like, if you want to see African American hands, you have to actually search black hands, because like the concept of hand is assumed to be a white hand, and like that is definitely a social construct, right? Which the algorithm has been trained, if you think about how the Google search algorithms work, somehow trained by the users themselves. And that's one of the things that LaTanya Sweeney found as well when she was doing the, she found that her name and other black names, like if you Googled them, just their name, then it would more often come out with like, hey, do you want to see the criminal record of this person? And it wasn't, at least Google claimed it wasn't anything that the Google had done, but rather the way that the algorithm learns from the users. The users are more likely to click yes if the name sounds black. So there's that interaction. And I would argue that the gorilla thing, which was obviously a huge embarrassment, yes, it talks about and I wish Joy were here, because then she could talk so articulately about this. But yes, it's a question of bias of the algorithm, but I would say it also speaks volumes of the culture itself, that where it was created and there was no testing. There was so little testing on black faces that this was put out into production without anyone noticing the problem. And I just feel like that is actually the story here. Because we should expect we should expect bias in the algorithms, but the story of when do we catch those errors? is, I think, just as important a question culturally.
And that ties really interestingly to the unfairness of the job thing, because it's sort of a loop, because all the engineers are white men.
Yeah.
So how are they going to test it on black faces if there are no one in their little community? I mean, you're going to tend to bias towards the people who are writing the code. And
I'll add to that, which is like, I worked, after I left finance, I worked as a data scientist, and I was doing ad tech, which so many data scientists do, right? And we choose like which ads people will see. And I remember a venture capitalist coming to our company and sort of advertising this as a service to the people. Like, oh, I'm doing the service, showing them the ads that they want to see. That's a service to them. I looked into it and I found like, oh, well, there's also predatory ads, right? There's predatory ads like the ads for payday lenders, the ads for for-profit colleges, which I looked into quite a lot and found that like for-profit college ads, for-profit colleges, by the way, just as if you don't know, are not educational institutions. They prey upon people that are in the intersection of poor enough to qualify for federal aid and ignorant enough about the way colleges actually work that they'll think that for-profit is equivalent to private. They don't know the difference between for-profit and private college. Usually they're children of immigrants. None of their relatives have gone to college, but they know that they need to go to college in order to be a middle-class citizen. So they get preyed upon, literally preyed upon. And going back to your comment, like, when I realized that I was contributing to that technology, I was like, the only reason we can do this is because we are not preyed upon. We're literally building a system where we always benefit, and the people that suffer are people we do not know, they do not share our part of the world with them. So I do think there's a lot there to understand. Like, when do we notice mistakes?
Mm-hmm. So,
What is this? Is this a system?
microphone.
I was like,
he's not going to throw it at you, don't worry.
oh, it's a microphone?
It's a microphone.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, it's a microphone. So I'm curious if anyone in the class knows the QA procedures behind an algorithm, a program like this. I asked that question because in development nowadays, the trend is away from having a bunch of QA folks run tests over and over and over again, and now it's, I'm going to build my test ahead of time. What are my inputs? What are my outputs? And then use those automated tests to determine whether or not to deploy something to production. Now, I know that works for a lot of web, but I don't know how it works with images and other machine learning algorithms. And my hypothesis would be, if there's a trend towards just automated testing, it's something that is less likely to catch something like this versus having your former army of QA folks looking out for it.
That's a good question. Kathy, do you know?
I don't know, but maybe
Karthik?
we need the cube.
So basically, what most people do is you have a training set and you say, I'm going to do an 80-20 split of the set. I will set aside 20% for testing. So I'll just store it under lock and key. And so I'll take the 80% of the training set, I'll basically train my algo, and I'll just run it past the 20% held out set. And so the question is, how much of black faces and how much of racial diversity was there in the original data set to begin with, even before you kind of try to split this up, which is not what most machine learning people do. I don't know if that makes sense.
I think you just explained like in-sample, out-of-sample testing, but I don't think that can't be the extent of actual quality assurance in a place like Facebook. That can't. Tell me it's not. I mean, they have to ask the question, like, for whom does this algorithm fail?
For Facebook and Google.
I don't know how it works with Facebook. I'm asking.
I mean, you can also finish your point too, if.
Yeah,
which is,
you have tricks, things like user engagement. Thank you.
Sit there.
Just like user engagement, right? So anytime you roll out any new system or change in Google search engine or a Facebook, you have to show that you're not adversely impacting any user engagement metrics. So even before you can do that, you basically run this by 20%. You kind of deploy it. They do A/B testing. So they basically route traffic into two buckets, and they try to make sure that people in the two buckets are very similar. And unless you show in their engine with this A/B testing that you're not adversely impacting any metric, then you're basically given a green light to ship, which is not, it doesn't really test any of the social constructs that Kathy talked about.
Unbelievable.
And this is just to reiterate that, did you ask that question because are you a software engineer?
I was an analyst before.
Okay, and so I was a product manager for a big tech company and Google. And like you said, there are tests around metrics or user engagement, all these things, but social biases and like the impact, the deep impact of users over a long period of time, ethics around what you build, should you build it? No, none of that. And Tim Huang actually has an initiative he's thinking about starting around. He has a hypothesis or theory, and I think it's fairly accurate, is oftentimes tests are done on whatever data sets you happen to get your hands on at any point in time. And it's because you're shipping so fast, and these are across all big tech companies, like what do you happen to have around? And it could be as extensive or not extensive or as haphazard as whatever it is just happens to be sitting around. And Tim is actually thinking about maybe trying to make better training data sets, but then that's a big undertaking, right? And so, but yeah, to answer your question, no, they're not thinking about it. We in this room can help them think about it. And I think that's why some of us are here, but they are definitely not thinking about it.
I was just about to say that it is unfortunate that Joy's not here, because I think that her recent paper, which I may or may not have posted in the channel I've been spamming you all on, does just that, which is create a better training set for face data that
I would point out that with Joy's this previous work that she did was on just recognizing faces at all, and it wasn't recognizing her face. And she found that the underlying libraries were not recognizing dark faces, and they were being used by a whole bunch of other products. But in her recent work, where she basically takes to task Microsoft and IBM, and where she's showing that I think it's the prediction of gender. It works very well for white men, worse for women, worse for dark-colored people, and especially worse for the intersection of female dark-colored faces. But I mean, she took them to task, and it's in the New York Times, stuff like that. So I would say that if you're a bunch of white guys writing some code and in a library, and you don't even know the problem, obviously you're not going to create a test for it. Once you're on the front page of the New York Times, and I don't know if was she on the front page of the MIT site, and in the New York Times, you're not going to make the exact same mistake again. I think the problem is there's sort of almost an infinite number of mistakes you can make. And I think so at this particular category of mistake, I think Joy is starting to get to a point where I think most big companies are going to say, okay, have we tested for this particular thing? And I think that's the problem with writing tests, is you can only write the tests that you can imagine. You imagine the tests in a biased way because we all can only understand what we understand. You have some comments? I think there's a couple of different comments. You want to go first, and then we'll move it.
Yeah.
Can you on the mic?
I just wanted to flag that something that some of us were talking about the other day, but specifically about the Google Photos gorilla case. It's not, the problem isn't only that there was a failure to recognize faces of people with dark skin. It's that what was returned was something that was not a neutral error. Mm-hmm. It was something that reinforced really ugly ideology about race. And so the kind of thing that we want to be protecting against isn't just like, are we getting accuracy rates that are lower? It's like, what kind of errors do we get when we have failures? Because it seems very plausible to me that there's a distinct kind of harm in having yourself labeled a gorilla that goes way beyond, like, it can't tell me from my sister or something like that.
And I will point out, though, that there's also, and Sendel was thinking of being here, he couldn't be here, but he has an opinion on this, which is, but we do want to make sure that we don't just whitewash the problem, because you see the ugly thing, And for instance, we don't use race as an input, but we use proxies for race. So we pretend like we're not racist, but we are. And so I think, weirdly, these sorts of shocking results actually point to something, and that we shouldn't try to just like eliminate the ability to search for gorilla. We need to figure out how this problem happened in the first place, right?
Yeah.
And
On this point, I just wanted to also mention that right now at the Berkman Klein Center, we have a little shelf in the lounge that we call a mini gallery, and the fellow Jenny Korn, who does a lot of work on race, has an installation up that's really about the biases in us, less just, yes, there's the algorithms are biased, but so are we, and so anybody who's on the Harvard campus, I just wanted to, it's basically a chance, it says, what do you think of when you think of professor, barber, singer, these different things, and you're sort of asked to racialize it, and then you can see the Google search results that she had returned underneath these sort of like cards. So anyway, it's very provocative, but I would just encourage everybody to check it out.
And it is interesting because it ties a little bit to unconscious bias and reflection. So I think, there are people who are bigoted and proud, but I think there are a lot of people who are bigoted and unaware. And I think one of the things that we might figure out are interfaces that allow people to be more reflective.
I think where all this becomes really tricky in the perspective of the tech companies is they really view themselves as objective tools versus a force exerting societal perspective. And so what this means is, rather than going in and saying this is where we'd like to see society go, to them that is an intervention that exerts a perspective. And especially when you look at something like Google, they don't want to say, we are a search engine that will tell you the societally progressive views that you want to see. And I think that's kind of unfortunate, but I think that's also what they're basing their business model off of. So that's where it becomes really conflicted.
And I don't want to get too far away from algorithms, but I remember during the Iran election uprisings a while ago, I think that just around then Facebook changed their privacy settings so that suddenly you could see who people's friends were, and it severely jeopardized a bunch of the activists. And I think one of the things that we don't think about a lot when we're in the United States is that all of the decisions we make about interface and about algorithms get pushed internationally with even less ability for those people who have problems to voice things back. Now, there are more and more channels, but it's still very poorly operated. Mike.
I guess as a last point on this, are there any examples of organizations who've set up their governance structure? And I'm approaching this from a very technical standpoint, but is there an organization that has a governance structure that injects these concerns into the QA process to product managers? Like in a lot of, and I ask this because you almost have to have a court that decides, and I'm thinking as a law student, you have to have a court that decides race is something we ought to push back against the underlying data. Gender is something we ought to push back against the underlying data. And you have these inputs that are different from the underlying data, and somebody needs to communicate that and push it down through the organization.
And then,
Hey. So I just wanted to add to this that I understand that there's a lot of complexity in understanding the extent of bias in output, but there's also a lot of simplicity in testing it. There are legally protected characteristics, and if you were to aggregate the protected characteristics from Europe and the US and Canada, there's only 17. There's no reason why we're not expecting tech companies to test at least the output to see if they are discriminatory as indicated in law, and to expect them to not put to market products that are illegal.
so
I'll just jump in and say that I'll talk about this a little bit more, but I did start an algorithmic auditing company to do exactly this, to set standards. But the truth is, these companies do not want to know the answer to these questions, because for the most part, they do not know how to fix their problems.
right.
And they don't want to acknowledge that they're not objective tools. So it's a plausible deniability issue at this point.
And we'll, as we get further into this, we'll see that it's also some of the things that may seem like simple questions in the courtroom actually become kind of complex when you think about them technically. This is, so redlining, as you know, is, I think, mostly illegal, right? It's the idea of taking districts and providing services like telephone and other things to only certain neighborhoods and avoiding the disadvantaged communities. So when you look at Amazon Prime for free same-day delivery, they use an algorithm to try to figure out where their primary customers are going to be and to service those first. And what you end up with as a result is redlining. And so they inadvertently created a system that basically in this area didn't service the low-income areas. And so the other problem, and I think more broadly, this gets a little bit to the question about auditing as well, is that you just crunch through the data optimizing for user engagement and ad optimization, and you can end up stumbling into all kinds of unfairness, because fundamentally, if you're a business and you're trying to optimize for making more money, you are trying to exploit vulnerabilities, and fundamentally, you're going to identify either vulnerable because they're poor or vulnerable because they don't know better than to sign up for a for-profit university. And so I think that one of the key problems, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, is what are we optimizing for? Predictive policing is another example, and I think we've mentioned this in the class before, but it's taking police data, arrest records, other things to try to help people in a minority report sort of way figure out what neighborhoods they should be policing. But as you can imagine, the more you police a neighborhood, the more arrests you will make, and the more arrests you will make, the more it looks like there is crime in that neighborhood, and it will continue to reinforce this bias into a more and more unfair way. And we already know with stop and frisk that it's racially biased, and so you have these neighborhoods where you're going to continue to reinforce the targeting. And I think Kathy will talk more about what do you call the weapons of mass destruction that are
The destructive feedback loop?
Destructive feedback loop. So this, I think, is a great example of a destructive feedback loop, which is you're just continuing to use the algorithm to create more data that makes it more biased. So this is a Natalie slide, I think. It's a Karthik slide. But I think the point here is that, again, this is the sort of prediction versus intervention, which is, I think, again, by just trying to make the criminal justice system more efficient and more accurately putting people in jail for exactly the statistically correct amount of time doesn't necessarily lower crime, doesn't make society better. And I think if we start looking at subsystems and optimizing, we're really not fixing the whole system. And so just prediction versus trying to intervene in a system and make it better are very different things. And that's true whether we're talking about criminal justice, things like insurance and finance. And I think the confounding thing with things like insurance and finance is you've got this capitalist value system right now in American democracy, which sort of gives people a moral authority to optimize for returns above many other things. Mental health also, I mean, I think this more broadly on the point of bias, I think it's really interesting because, on the first day I showed a slide of the founding fathers of America, a bunch of white people who said every man is created equal, but not women, not the slaves. And even with mental health, I think there are a number of categories of neurodiversity that don't have the same rights. And I think it's really interesting how, if you look historically, you could say, I can't imagine that we thought these people weren't human, or I can't imagine that these gay people weren't allowed to get married. And so I don't think there's any proof that looking at ourselves 100 years from now, we won't look at ourselves as just as weirdly biased. And the fact that we're locking in these biases and creating these positive feedback cycles to make it maybe even harder to be reflective or to get out of these cycles, I think is a risk. And I think I think it's related to insurance, but the medical field has, I think Karthik's work was showing that women weren't considered to be cardiac risks. So there's hardly any data on female patients in clinical trials. So you have this data that sort of shows that men tend to have more cardiac arrests, and in fact, that's not true. And so the underlying data bias of what sorts of clinical trials have occurred also fundamentally changes the kind of treatment people have.